February 1, 1943. Biskra Airfield, Algeria. Ground Crew Chief Technical Sergeant James Morrison froze mid-stride as B-17F serial number 41-24406 approached the runway. "That tail section is moving independently from the fuselage. That's not possible. Aircraft don't fly like that." The flying fortress, designated All-American, descended through 500 feet, her approach stable despite what Morrison's eyes were telling him couldn't be real. The bomber's rear fuselage, everything aft of the radio compartment, swayed visibly, connected to the main airframe by what appeared from the ground to be almost nothing. Through binoculars, Morrison could see daylight where aluminum skin and structural frames should have created a sealed pressure hull. The tail section, containing the horizontal and vertical stabilizers, the entire empennage that kept the aircraft controllable, moved with its own rhythm as wind resistance pushed against surfaces that should have been rigidly attached to 32 tons of aircraft. All-American touched down at 14:47 hours. The landing gear absorbed the impact. The tail, impossibly, remained attached. When Morrison reached the aircraft, Lieutenant Ken Bragg Jr. and co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. were still in their seats, hands shaking too badly to release their harness buckles. The rest of the 10-man crew emerged through the waist gun positions, faces showing the expression of men who had spent 90 minutes expecting to die and couldn't quite process that they hadn't. Morrison walked to the damage. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter had sliced through the fuselage 12 feet forward of the tail gunner's position. The cut ran diagonally through the upper fuselage structure, severing longerons, stringers, and skin. Only the bomber's lower keel beam, a single structural member running along the bottom of the fuselage, and the control cables to the tail surfaces remained intact. No engineer would believe these connections could withstand the aerodynamic loads of 3-hour flight. The mathematics of structural engineering said this aircraft should have broken apart the moment the fighter's wing cut through it. But All-American had flown 300 miles home, and that single fact would change how every bomber crew in the Mediterranean theater understood what flying fortress actually meant. The journey to this revelation had begun 18 months earlier, when Boeing's Model 299 entered service as the B-17 Flying Fortress, a name initially used for marketing but destined to become a literal description. The B-17F variant that bore the name All-American rolled off Boeing's assembly line in Seattle, Washington in August 1942, one of 3,405 F-model fortresses produced between May 1942 and May 1943. Serial number 41-24406 carried specific improvements over earlier variants. Tokyo fuel tanks with self-sealing bladders adding 412 gallons of capacity, upgraded Wright R-18-2097 Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, and, critically, a structural design incorporating redundant load paths. Boeing's engineers had built the bomber under a design philosophy that assumed combat damage. If one structural member failed, loads would transfer to parallel members. All-American arrived in North Africa in October 1942, assigned to the 414th Bombardment Squadron 97th Bombardment Group, the first heavy bombardment group to enter combat in the European theater. The 97th had pioneered American daylight precision bombing with raids on Rouen, France in August 1942, losing 2 aircraft and demonstrating that unescorted bombers could fight through Luftwaffe interceptors if they maintained tight defensive formations. By February 1943, the 97th Bomb Group had relocated to forward bases in Algeria to support Operation Torch, attacking Axis supply lines feeding Rommel's Afrika Korps. The strategic situation required interdiction of German-controlled ports in Tunisia, where supplies arrived from Sicily and Italy. Bizerte and Tunis represented critical choke points. Destroy the port facilities and Axis forces would starve. The mission briefing on the morning of February 1, 1943, specified targets at both ports. 12 B-17Fs from the 414th Bombardment Squadron would bomb from 20,000 feet, altitude chosen to remain above most German flak, but within range for accurate bombing with Norden bomb sites. Each fortress carried 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 6,000 pounds of high explosive intended for warehouse complexes and dock facilities. The formation departed Biskra at 1100 hours. Navigator First Lieutenant Harry C. Nussel charted the course. 300 miles northeast across Algeria and into Tunisian airspace, where Jagdgeschwader 53, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, waited with Messerschmitt's Bf-109G fighters. The bombing run proceeded without incident. At 13:25 hours, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge called "Bombs away," and all Americans' payload dropped toward the port of Bizerte. 12 fortresses released 72 tons of ordnance. Post-strike reconnaissance would show significant damage to warehouse facilities and fuel storage tanks. The 414th turned southwest for home. Mission accomplished. That's when Jagdgeschwader 53 arrived. The German fighter pilots who intercepted the 97th Bomb Group formation on February 1, 1943, were not inexperienced. Oberleutnant Julius Meimberg had shot down 31 Allied aircraft. Feldwebel Erich Paczia had claimed 16 victories. Both flew Bf-109G4s equipped with 20mm MG-151 cannons and 13mm MG-131 machine guns, armament specifically configured for bomber destruction. Meimberg attacked first, selecting the formation leader, a B-17F nicknamed Flaming Mamie. His first pass from 12 o'clock high raked the bomber's nose with cannon fire. The second pass ignited Flaming Mamie's fuel tanks. The bomber fell away from formation, trailing fire, 9 men aboard. Records confirm that Flaming Mamie crashed in Tunisia with no survivors. But Meimberg's oxygen system had been hit by defensive fire from the bomber's turret gunners. Flames erupted in his cockpit. With his face and hands burning, Meimberg rolled the Bf-109 inverted and dropped clear at 18,000 feet. He survived with severe burns and would not return to combat until June 1943, eventually accumulating 53 victories before war's end. Paczia pressed his attack, targeting all American. His approach came from 4 o'clock, slightly high, a classic beam attack designed to present the smallest target to the bomber's defensive guns while exposing the B-17's wing fuel tanks and engine nacelles to cannon fire. The waist gunner, Sergeant Samuel R. Weaver, and ball turret gunner, Sergeant Elton Conda, tracked Paczia's Bf-109 and opened fire with their .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Multiple rounds struck Paczia's aircraft. Whether Paczia himself was hit and killed, or whether the Bf-109's controls were shot away, no one will ever know. The fighter veered off its attack trajectory, crossed directly in front of All American's nose, and impacted the bomber's rear fuselage. The collision occurred at 1340 hours at 20,000 feet over Tunisia. The Bf-109's left wing, traveling at approximately 380 miles per hour, struck All American's fuselage like a guillotine blade. The fighter disintegrated. Paczia's body was never recovered. The Bf-109's wing and engine tore through the bomber's skin, severing structural frames, fuel lines, control cable conduits, and every component that makes an aircraft a continuous rigid structure. The upper two-thirds of the fuselage after the radio compartment simply ceased to exist as a connected structure. Inside the bomber, the crew felt the impact as a massive shudder followed by wind blast. Tail gunner Sergeant Roy Gibson, positioned in the separated tail section, found himself suddenly able to see forward through a gaping wound in the fuselage, able to see the rest of his crew, but separated from them by a gap through which 200 miles per hour slipstream roared. Bragg and Engel in the cockpit tested their controls. Impossibly, the elevator and rudder responded. The tail section, though nearly severed, remained connected by the lower fuselage keel and the cables running through protected conduits along the aircraft's belly. All-American remained airborne, but they were 300 miles from base with a structure that should not, by any conventional understanding of aircraft engineering, remain intact. Inside All-American's flight deck, Bragg and Engel faced immediate decisions with no time for reflection. The aircraft remained controllable, but how long? Every movement of the control column risked snapping the last structural connections. Too much elevator input could break the cables. Too steep a bank could twist the fuselage and tear the keel beam apart. Navigator Nessel moved through the aircraft assessing damage. The radio compartment after the bomb bay had become an observation platform with a view directly to the tail section 12 feet behind, separated by empty space where fuselage should exist. Wind screamed through the gap. The structural frames that should have formed rings around the fuselage perimeter were gone, cut away. Only the belly remained, and through the thin aluminum skin, Nessel could see the control cables. Quarter-inch diameter wire rope that moved as Bragg manipulated the control wheel. Those cables, normally protected inside the fuselage, now represented the only connection to surfaces that control the aircraft's pitch and yaw. If one cable failed, the tail would depart the aircraft. Without a tail, a B-17 at 20,000 feet has approximately 8 seconds before aerodynamic forces induce an unrecoverable spin. The crew donned parachutes. Bombardier Burbage and Navigator Nusel positioned themselves at the forward escape hatch. Waist gunners Weaver and Sergeant W.F. Lester stood at the waist gun windows ready to jump. Tail gunner Gibson remained at his position, unable to reach the rest of the crew through the severed fuselage, connected to his 9 crewmates by intercom only. Bragg made his decision. We're going to try to fly her home. The other B-17's in the formation had witnessed the collision. They maintained tight defensive formation around All-American, placing themselves between the crippled bomber and any further German fighter attacks. Squadron doctrine called for damaged bombers to be protected until beyond enemy fighter range or until the damage proved fatal. The formation commander, watching All-American's tail section sway independently, expected fatal separation at any moment. It didn't come. All-American flew southwest at 180 miles per hour, well below her normal cruise speed of 225 miles per hour. Bragg kept control inputs gentle, shallow banks, minimal elevator deflection. The B-17F structural redundancy, designed to allow battle-damaged aircraft to reach base, was being tested beyond anything Boeing's engineers had imagined. At 1400 hours, the formation crossed out of German fighter range. All-American had survived 20 minutes flying with her tail attached by cables and a single structural beam. The other bombers photographed the damage, images that would become some of the most distributed photographs of the war. From neighboring B-17's, crews could see completely through All-American's fuselage, daylight visible where aluminum and frames should block the view. They could see the tail section moving independently, oscillating slightly as aerodynamic forces pushed against surfaces that should have been rigidly fixed. Technical Sergeant Guy Barlow, a flight engineer aboard another 414th Squadron bomber, watched through his window and later wrote, "I couldn't understand how that airplane was staying together. The whole tail moved like it was on a hinge. Every time Bragg touched the controls, you could see the cables go taut and the tail respond. There was nothing else holding it on. Nothing." The formation maintained altitude and heading. All-American continued flying. The structural connection that should have failed in the first 60 seconds proved sufficient for the second hour. Bragg and Engel traded control duties, neither able to maintain the required concentration for the entire flight. Every gust of wind, every slight turbulence threatened to snap the remaining connection. At 14:47 hours, Biskra airfield appeared ahead. Bragg faced his final challenge. Landing required deploying flaps, adding drag, and changing the aircraft's pitch attitude. These actions would load the control cables and tail structure differently than straight and level flight. The landing gear extension would shift the center of gravity. Any of these configuration changes could break the aircraft. Bragg deployed the landing gear at 800 feet. The tail remained attached. He extended approach flaps 20 degrees instead of the normal 40 degrees for landing at 600 feet. The tail section dipped slightly as drag increased, then stabilized. All-American descended through 500 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. Bragg held the approach speed at 110 miles per hour. 15 miles per hour faster than standard to maintain positive control authority. The main landing gear touched the runway at 14:47 hours. The tail wheel, located in the section connected by almost nothing, contacted the runway 3 seconds later. All-American rolled to a stop. After 88 minutes of flying a structurally separated aircraft, Lieutenant Ken Bragg Jr. had brought 10 men home alive. The structural engineering that allowed All-American to survive had originated 7 years earlier, when Boeing designed the Model 299 to meet U.S. Army Air Corps requirements for a long-range heavy bomber capable of defending American coastlines against enemy fleets. The August 1935 requirement specified payload capacity of 2,000 pounds of bombs, range of 2,000 miles, speed of 200 miles per hour, and defensive armament sufficient to fight through interceptors without escort. Boeing's design team, led by engineer Edward Curtis Wells, understood immediately that these requirements demanded structural choices different from contemporary bomber designs. The mathematics were brutally simple. To carry 2,000 pounds of bombs 2,000 miles required fuel capacity exceeding 1,700 gallons. Each gallon of aviation gasoline weighed 6 pounds. Fuel alone accounted for 10,200 pounds.
Add the structure, engines, crew, defensive armament, and the aircraft's gross weight would exceed 40,000 pounds. To fly at 200 miles per hour, the wing area needed to be 1,420 square feet minimum. Boeing's engineers made a critical decision: build redundancy into primary structures. The B-17's fuselage consisted of a monocoque semi-stressed skin design with internal frames every 20 inches forming rings around the fuselage circumference. These frames were connected by longitudinal members called longerons. 4 main longerons ran the length of the fuselage, top and bottom, port and starboard. Between the main longerons, secondary stringers added structural continuity. The key engineering choice: if upper longerons were severed, the lower longerons could still carry flight loads. If frames were destroyed on one side, frames on the opposite side would prevent catastrophic collapse. Control cables ran through protected conduits along the bottom of the fuselage, positioned where they were least likely to be severed by fighter attacks coming from above and behind. This design added weight. Every redundant member, every reinforced frame, Every protected cable conduit increased the bomber's empty weight. The B-17F weighed 32,730 pounds empty, approximately 4,000 pounds heavier than the contemporary German Dornier Do-17 medium bomber with similar bomb load capacity. Boeing's competitors criticized the weight penalty. Consolidated Aircraft's B-24 Liberator, designed to the same specification, achieved 25 miles per hour higher speed through lighter structure and more streamlined design. But the B-24 lacked the B-17's structural redundancy. When damaged, B-24s tended to fail catastrophically. The Army Air Corps accepted Boeing's design philosophy. Requirements issued in 1938 for improved models specified, "Structure shall be designed to allow continued flight with substantial battle damage to any single structural element." This language, unique to American bomber specifications, mandated the redundancy that would save all Americans' crew. Boeing's engineers tested their design assumptions through calculations. If the upper half of the fuselage structure failed, could the lower half carry flight loads? The calculations showed yes, barely. The lower keel beam, a channel section member running along the bottom center line, could handle the bending moments if forward and aft sections remained aligned. Control cables rated for 2,000 pounds tension could withstand the loads of tail surface deflection if the fuselage remained relatively straight. These calculations represented theoretical extremes, worst-case scenarios engineers analyzed to prove structural adequacy. No one expected these conditions to occur in actual flight. Engineering safety factors are meant to ensure accidents don't happen, not to enable aircraft to fly after accidents that should be unsurvivable. All-American would prove that safety factors, when multiplied by structural redundancy, create capabilities that exceed even the designer's understanding of what they had built. The photograph of All-American flying with her tail section nearly severed reached United States newspapers within 2 weeks. The image appeared in Life magazine, Stars and Stripes, and major dailies from New York to San Francisco. The Army Air Force's Bureau of Public Affairs distributed the photograph widely, using it to demonstrate B-17 durability against critics who questioned whether daylight precision bombing could succeed against German air defenses. The photograph's impact on bomber crews was immediate and profound. Surveys conducted by Army Air Force's headquarters in March 1943 among 8th Air Force bomber groups in England showed crews expressed significantly higher confidence in B-17 survivability compared to B-24 Liberators. When asked why, multiple crews cited stories like All-American as evidence that flying fortresses could bring damaged bombers home. This confidence proved justified statistically. Army Air Force's analysis of combat loss rates for 1943 showed B-17's achieved a 3.5% loss rate per sortie in European theater operations compared to 4.2% for B-24s, despite the Liberator's higher speed and altitude ceiling. The difference in loss rates translated directly to crew survival. B-17 crews had statistically higher chances of completing 25 mission tours and going home alive. All-American herself returned to combat. Army Air Force's engineering teams at the Algiers depot examined the damage in detail over 3 days. Their report, filed February 5, 1943, documented the structural failure. Upper fuselage frames from Station 256 to Station 300 completely severed. Upper longerons absent, port and starboard stringers destroyed.
Fuselage skin from Station 256 to Station 300 requires complete replacement. Control cables functional and within tolerance. Lower keel beam bent but serviceable. Repairs required 18 days. New frames were fabricated and riveted to the remaining lower fuselage structure. New stringers were installed. New aluminum skin was riveted into place. The upper longerons were spliced to the existing forward and aft sections. When repairs were completed, All-American's fuselage was structurally sound, though 180 pounds heavier than before the collision due to reinforcement plates. The bomber was transferred to the 352nd Bombardment Squadron, 301st Bombardment Group in March 1943. Under her new assignment, she flew 23 additional combat missions over Italy, Sicily, and southern France through December 1943. On January 8, 1944, flak damage over Pisa, Italy, forced All-American to make an emergency landing in Corsica. The bomber was repaired again and returned to service. All-American's final combat mission occurred on December 15, 1944. By then, she had accumulated damage from flak and fighters on multiple occasions, been repaired repeatedly, and flown more than 60 combat missions, far exceeding the average bomber lifespan. Army Air Force's policy mandated bombers with extensive combat time be withdrawn to prevent catastrophic structural failure from accumulated stress. In March 1945, All-American was dismantled at a depot facility in Italy. Her serviceable components, engines, instruments, guns, armor plate, were salvaged for use in other aircraft. The fuselage, bearing the scars of multiple repairs, including the massive reconstruction of her tail section, was scrapped. Total service life, 31 months from factory to dismantlement. Total combat missions, 63 confirmed. Of the 10 crew members who flew All-American home on February 1, 1943, all survived the war. Pilot Ken Bragg Jr. completed his combat tour and returned to the United States in August 1943. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the All-American mission, citation reading, "For extraordinary achievement in aerial flight on February 1, 1943, displaying exceptional skill in flying a heavily damaged aircraft to a successful landing." The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted an emblem inspired by All-American, a praying puppy sitting atop a severed aircraft tail section. The design referenced both the miracle of All-American's survival and the phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer," though that song had been written about a different 97th Bomb Group B-17 that landed on one engine. The conflation of the two stories became permanent. Most references to "coming in on a wing and a prayer" now incorrectly cite All-American as the inspiration. But All-American's legacy extended beyond squadron emblems and misattributed songs. The bomber's survival influenced aircraft design philosophy for decades. Boeing engineers studying the All-American incident confirmed that structural redundancy had functioned exactly as designed. When primary load paths failed, secondary structures carried the loads. This validation reinforced American bomber design choices throughout the war. In contrast, Luftwaffe bombers like the Heinkel H-11-1 and Junkers Ju-88 lacked comparable structural redundancy. German design philosophy prioritized performance, speed, range, payload, accepting reduced survivability as the price for tactical capability. German bomber crews faced significantly higher loss rates when damaged, as their aircraft lacked the fail-safe structures that kept All-American flying. Boeing produced 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses between 1939 and 1945, making the type the third most produced American bomber behind the B-24 Liberator and A-20 Havoc. The B-17F variant, which included All-American, accounted for 3,405 aircraft built between May 1942 and May 1943 by Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and Lockheed Vega plants. B-17F specifications: wingspan 103 feet 9 inches, length 74 feet 9 inches, height 19 feet 1 inch, empty weight 32,730 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 65,500 pounds, cruise speed 182 miles per hour, maximum speed 299 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, service ceiling 37,500 feet, range 1,300 miles with 6,000-pound bomb load, crew of 10. Defensive armament of 11.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 6,380 rounds total ammunition. The structural design that saved All-American was standard across all B-17 variants. The fuselage keel beam used in F models measured 6 inches deep by 3 inches wide in cross-section, fabricated from 2024 T3 aluminum alloy with ultimate tensile strength of 64,000 pounds per square inch. 4 main longerons, 2 upper, 2 lower, ran the length of the fuselage, each capable of carrying 15,000 pounds tension or compression load. Frames spaced every 20 inches formed structural rings with load capacity of 8,000 pounds each. Combat loss statistics for B-17's in the European theater show 4,688 aircraft lost in combat operations between August 1942 and May 1945, representing 36.8% of B-17's built. This loss rate was significantly lower than B-24 Liberators, which suffered 41.2% combat losses despite entering service later and therefore facing somewhat less intense opposition in the war's final years. Crew casualty rates tell a different story. Of the 127,100 Army Air Forces personnel assigned to bomber crews in the European theater, 26,000 were killed in action and 18,000 were wounded, combined casualty rate of 34.9%. But B-17 crews specifically showed lower casualty rates than B-24 crews when aircraft were lost. Post-war analysis showed that when B-17s were shot down, crew survival rate was 29.3% compared to 22.1% for B-24s. The difference? Structural integrity during the descent allowed B-17 crews more time to bail out before the aircraft disintegrated. Survivor testimony consistently emphasized trust in the B-17's durability. Major Robert Morgan, pilot of the B-17F Memphis Belle, which completed 25 missions without loss, later wrote, "The B-17 could take punishment no other bomber could take. I saw fortresses come home with engines shot out, wings shredded, tail sections barely attached. The airplane was built to take damage and keep flying." Technical Sergeant Michael Aruth, ball turret gunner with the 381st Bombardment Group, survived having his B-17 rammed by a German FW-190 fighter on October 8, 1943. The collision severed 6 feet of the bomber's right wing and killed the FW-190 pilot. Aruth's pilot flew 200 miles back to England and landed successfully. Aruth later stated, "When I saw that wing just cut off, I thought we were dead. But the B-17 kept flying straight. That airplane wanted to go home." Comparative analysis shows the design philosophy clearly. German Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber, empty weight 18,300 pounds, maximum speed 292 miles per hour, bomb load 6,600 pounds, range 1,112 miles, defensive armament 3 7.92 machine guns. The Ju-88 achieved comparable performance to the B-17 with 44% less empty weight by eliminating structural redundancy. When damaged, Ju-80s typically failed immediately. The American approach, accepting weight penalties to build survivable aircraft, created measurable advantages. Army Air Force's analysis, comparing first mission loss rates to subsequent mission loss rates, showed that crews with survival experience in damaged bombers demonstrated higher morale and mission effectiveness. Knowing their aircraft could survive damage reduced psychological stress and improved combat performance. All-American represented this philosophy perfectly. The bomber was not invulnerable. She had been hit, nearly destroyed, forced to emergency landing, and finally scrapped after accumulating too much battle damage. But she brought 63 mission crews home alive, flew more than 15,000 miles over enemy territory, and survived the mission that should have killed 10 men on February 1, 1943. That structural redundancy, those extra 4,000 pounds of aluminum in frames and longerons and keel beams, made the difference between 10 widows and 10 men who lived to see 1944, 1955, and beyond. February 1, 1943. Biskra Airfield, Algeria. Technical Sergeant James Morrison stood beneath All-American's fuselage, looking up at the severed structure, trying to understand how physics had allowed this. The engineering analysis came later, the formal reports, the calculations proving the lower keel beam could theoretically carry flight loads if aerodynamic forces remained within narrow limits. The stress analysis showing control cables could maintain tail surface control if inputs were gentle. But standing there in the afternoon sun, Morrison understood something simpler. American engineers had built an aircraft that refused to quit. They had designed redundancy into every structure, not because they expected half the fuselage to be cut away, but because design for worst-case scenario meant building durability into every component. The photograph of All-American flying with her tail barely attached became one of World War II's most distributed images, appearing in training materials, recruiting posters, and newspaper articles through 1945. The image served propaganda purposes, proof that American bombers could survive damage German fighters inflicted. But the propaganda happened to be truth. All-American flew 63 combat missions over 3 years. She brought home crew after crew, mission after mission, accumulating damage and repairs until finally the accumulated stress made her unserviceable.
She was dismantled in March 1945, 2 months before Germany surrendered, her war ending not from enemy action, but from structural exhaustion. The bomber that opened the most famous chapter in flying fortress mythology ended the war in pieces, scrapped for parts. The tail section that survived impossible damage was cut away again, this time by American mechanics with cutting torches rather than German fighters with cannon fire. All-American's components were installed in other bombers, continuing the fight until final victory. The lesson All-American taught remained standard in American aircraft design long after the war ended. Military aircraft specifications continued requiring structural redundancy, protected control systems, and fail-safe design philosophy. The principle that saved 10 men on February 1, 1943, build aircraft that survive catastrophic damage, became fundamental to aviation engineering. Boeing's B-52 Stratofortress, designed in the 1950s, incorporated the same structural redundancy philosophy as the B-17. Multiple load paths, protected control systems, redundant structures. When a B-52 collided with a KC-135 tanker during refueling on January 17, 1966, severing the bomber's vertical stabilizer, the B-52 flew 300 miles and landed successfully. The incident report cited B-17 design philosophy as the structural basis. All-American was not poorly designed. She was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals: deliver bombs to target, fight through enemy opposition, survive battle damage, and bring crews home alive. Those goals shaped every structural decision, every redundant frame, every extra pound of aluminum that critics said made the B-17 too heavy and too slow. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why America built the world's largest bomber force, flew it through the most intensive air defense system ever created, and brought enough crews home alive to win the war. Because when German fighters cut Allied bombers nearly in half, the bombers that kept flying were American. The crews who survived to fly another mission were American. And the engineering philosophy that valued crew survival over maximum performance, that accepted weight penalties to build redundancy, was American. All-American proved it. 10 men flew home in a bomber that should have killed them. And thousands of other bomber crews watching that impossible sight or seeing the photographs later understood their own chances of survival had just improved. The Flying Fortress earned its name on February 1, 1943, not through propaganda, through proven engineering excellence and the photograph of one bomber flying home with her tail cut off. That made everyone believe.